Listen carefully, Netanyahu, and every Western power that believes Palestinian land can be purchased with blood-stained dollars. 3 minutes ago, your envoys arrived with another proposal, $50 billion in economic development funds, in exchange for our acceptance of your illegal settlements, your apartheid walls, and your permanent control over Jerusalem. I rejected it in 15 seconds. You believed you could buy our surrender with economic incentives while maintaining military occupation, systematic apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. You were catastrophically wrong. Let me tell you what your money actually represents. Every dollar you offer comes soaked in Palestinian blood. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against you in November 2024 for war crimes and crimes against humanity, making you an internationally recognized war criminal walking free only because Western powers protect you from justice despite their supposed commitment to international law and human rights. You command military operations that have killed over 30,000 Palestinian civilians since October 2023, including 12,300 children whose bodies were pulled from the rubble of homes your American-supplied F-35s obliterated with 2,000-pound bombs dropping on residential neighborhoods, schools serving as shelters, and hospitals treating wounded civilians. You maintain an illegal blockade starving 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, creating famine conditions that international humanitarian organizations classify as deliberate starvation, a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and Rome Statute. You oversee systematic torture in Israeli detention facilities where 8,400 Palestinians, including 340 children, are held without charges under administrative detention, enduring beatings, sexual abuse, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and psychological torture documented extensively by your own Israeli human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and testimonies from released detainees describing torture chambers operating with complete impunity. So when you offer us $50 billion for development, what you're actually offering is blood money, financial compensation for accepting your right to continue murdering us, stealing our land, demolishing our homes, and maintaining apartheid rule that even your allies increasingly recognize violates every principle of international law and human dignity. You're asking us to sign away our children's future, our grandparents' stolen homes in Haifa and Jaffa and Jerusalem, our sacred sites including Al-Aqsa Mosque that your extremist settlers attack daily under military protection, and our fundamental human rights to self-determination in return in exchange for construction projects and economic zones built on land you've ethnically cleansed of Palestinian presence through 75 years of systematic dispossession. Your proposal isn't economic development, it's the final payment for completing the Nakba your forces began in 1948 when Zionist militias expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, destroyed 530 Palestinian villages, erasing them completely from maps, and established Israel on the ruins of Palestinian society. You're offering money to make us accept that dispossession as permanent, to renounce our UN-recognized right of return, to legitimize your theft of 78% of historic Palestine in 1948 and your military occupation of the remaining 22% since 1967, and to grant you legal cover for apartheid that the International Court of Justice definitively ruled in July 2024 constitutes illegal annexation requiring immediate termination and full reparations to Palestinians for 57 years of occupation damages. Your entire settlement enterprise is illegal under international law, confirmed unequivocally by the International Court of Justice July 2024 advisory opinion stating that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory constitutes illegal annexation and apartheid requiring immediate termination with reparations to Palestinians. The ICJ specifically found that Israeli settlements violate Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibiting occupying powers from transferring their own civilian population into occupied territory, that Israel's two-tier legal system where Israeli settlers in occupied territory live under Israeli civil law with full rights while Palestinians live under military law without rights constitutes apartheid under international criminal law, that Israel's exploitation of Palestinian natural resources including water, minerals, and Dead Sea resources constitutes pillage prohibited under international humanitarian law, and that all states have obligations under international law to not recognize the illegal situation, to distinguish in their dealings between Israel proper and occupied territories, and to ensure Israel complies with international law, including through sanctions and accountability measures. Yet you respond to this definitive ICJ ruling, the highest judicial authority on international law, by announcing plans for 12,000 additional settlement units in the West Bank, by accelerating home demolitions, destroying 420 Palestinian structures in the West Bank during 2025 alone, displacing 2,800 Palestinians, including 1,400 children, and by promoting legislation to annex additional West Bank territory, formally incorporating Areas C comprising 60% of West Bank into Israel proper. This demonstrates absolute contempt for international law and confirms that your proposals aren't peace offers but annexation schemes disguised with economic incentives designed to buy Palestinian acceptance acceptance of permanent Israeli control over our land, resources, and lives. The July 2024 ICJ advisory opinion wasn't the first time international legal bodies condemned Israeli practices as illegal. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334 passed December 2016 with 14 votes in favor, and only the United States abstaining declared that Israeli settlements constitute a flagrant violation under international law with no legal validity, demanded Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities, and called on all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. The UN Human Rights Council commissioned multiple reports documenting systematic violations, including 2022 Commission of Inquiry finding reasonable grounds to conclude Israel commits crimes of apartheid and persecution. Amnesty International published February 2022 comprehensive 280-page report documenting how Israel enforces system of oppression and domination against Palestinians amounting to apartheid through fragmentation of Palestinian territory, segregation and control, dispossession of land and property, and denial of economic and social rights. Human Rights Watch published April 2021 report concluding Israeli authorities commit crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution through policies of systematic oppression and discriminatory acts. South Africa filed case at International Court of Justice January 2024 accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza through acts intended to destroy Palestinians as group, including killing, causing serious bodily and mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, case that ICJ found plausible enough to order provisional measures requiring Israel to prevent genocide and ensure humanitarian access. This overwhelming international legal consensus, ICJ advisory opinion, UNSC resolutions, UN Human Rights Council investigations, reports by world's leading human rights organizations, and ongoing ICJ genocide case proves definitively that Israeli occupation and settlement enterprise constitute systematic violations of fundamental international law. Your offers of economic development funds don't change legal reality that your entire presence in occupied Palestinian territory is illegal, that your settlements constitute war crimes under Rome Statute Article 8 prohibiting transfer of occupying powers' population into occupied territory, and that international law requires complete withdrawal and dismantlement of all settlements with reparations to Palestinians for decades of occupation damage. You offer $50 billion thinking money can purchase our acceptance of permanent dispossession, but no amount of money can compensate for what you've taken and what you continue to take every single day through systematic violence and theft. You've stolen our land, not metaphorically but literally through documented processes of expropriation, declaration of state lands, seizure for military needs, and transfer to Israeli settlers who farm Palestinian olive groves their grandparents tended for centuries, who build swimming pools using Palestinian water while nearby Palestinian villages ration water for drinking, and who raise their children in suburban developments constructed on the ruins of Palestinian villages your forces destroyed. Between 1967 and 2026, Israeli settlements expanded from 0 to 700,000 settlers living in 279 settlements and 147 outposts throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem, controlling 42% of West Bank land and consuming 86% of West Bank water resources, while Palestinian communities face severe water shortages with per capita consumption 1/4 of Israeli settler consumption despite living on same land under same climatic conditions. You've stolen our water, critical resource in arid climate essential for agriculture, drinking, sanitation, and survival. Israel controls all water resources in occupied Palestinian territory through military orders prohibiting Palestinians from drilling new wells without Israeli permits that are systematically denied, while Israeli settlers drill unlimited wells with automatic approval. The mountain aquifer beneath the West Bank generates approximately 679 million cubic meters annually, of which Israel extracts 483 million cubic meters, 71%, leaving only 196 million cubic meters, 29%, for 3 million Palestinians, while 700,000 Israeli settlers consume more water than entire Palestinian population. This water apartheid means Palestinians in West Bank consume average 73 liters per person daily, below the World Health Organization minimum standard of 100 liters for basic needs, while Israeli settlers consume average 369 liters per person daily, more than 5 times Palestinian consumption. In Gaza, your blockade restricts water infrastructure maintenance, creating catastrophic conditions where 97% of water from coastal aquifer is contaminated and unfit for human consumption, forcing 2.3 million Palestinians to purchase expensive desalinated water or risk serious health consequences from consuming contaminated water carrying diseases. You've stolen our freedom of movement through 645 permanent obstacles throughout the West Bank, including checkpoints, roadblocks, earth mounds, and trenches restricting Palestinian movement between towns and villages, turning 15-minute journeys into 4-hour ordeals requiring passage through military checkpoints where Israeli soldiers detain Palestinians arbitrarily, search vehicles invasively, and humiliate Palestinians daily through racist abuse and degrading treatment. The separation wall, declared illegal by ICJ 2004 advisory opinion which ordered its dismantlement, extends 712 kilometers, 85% inside occupied West Bank rather than along Green Line, separating 11,000 Palestinians from their agricultural lands and isolating 150,000 Jerusalem Palestinians from West Bank, cutting them from family, economic opportunities, hospitals, and universities. This wall isn't security barrier as Israel claims. If security was genuine purpose, it would follow internationally recognized border rather than snaking deep into Palestinian territory to encompass settlement blocks, but rather annexation wall designed to incorporate maximum Israeli settlements while isolating Palestinian communities in disconnected enclaves surrounded by Israeli military control. You've murdered our children, not through accidental crossfire or unintended consequences, but through deliberate policies that treat Palestinian children as legitimate military targets or acceptable collateral damage. Since October 2023, your military operations killed 12,300 Palestinian children in Gaza, children with names, dreams, families, futures, whose bodies were crushed under collapsed buildings, torn apart by shrapnel, burned by white phosphorus incendiary weapons Israel deployed in densely populated areas, or who died slowly from infected wounds when your blockade prevented medical supplies reaching hospitals. These aren't statistics. Each number represents a child who experienced terror as bombs fell, who cried for parents as buildings collapsed, who suffered agonizing deaths that could have been prevented had Israel permitted humanitarian access. In the West Bank, your forces killed 142 Palestinian children between January 2023 December 2025 through live ammunition during protests against settlement expansion, through raids on refugee camps where soldiers fire indiscriminately into residential areas, and through deliberate targeting of children throwing stones with sniper fire authorized under rules of engagement, treating stone throwing as lethal threat justifying lethal response. You've imprisoned our children. Israel is the only country systematically prosecuting children in military courts with conviction rate exceeding 99%, holding 340 Palestinian children in Israeli prisons where they experience solitary confinement, physical abuse, denial of family visits, and interrogation without parents or lawyers present in violation of Convention on Rights of the Child, which Israel signed but exempted occupied Palestinian territory from its application. Palestinian children as young as 12 face arrest through night raids where Israeli soldiers break into homes terrifying families, forcibly remove children from beds, transport them to interrogation centers where they're threatened, beaten, and coerced into signing confessions in Hebrew they don't understand, then prosecute them in military courts where conviction is virtually guaranteed. These children return traumatized, experiencing nightmares, bedwetting anxiety, and psychological damage from Israeli military detention that constitutes systematic child abuse under international law. No amount of money compensates for murdered children, stolen land, poisoned water, destroyed homes, traumatized population, and systematic denial of human dignity. Your $50 billion proposal is insult adding injury, suggesting that Palestinian acceptance of permanent dispossession and ongoing oppression can be purchased like any commodity if price is high enough. But Palestinian rights aren't for sale at any price because rights are inalienable inherent attributes of human dignity that cannot be traded, sold, or surrendered regardless of economic incentives offered. Your current $50 billion proposal isn't new strategy, but rather latest iteration of consistent Israeli approach throughout 75 years, offering Palestinians economic benefits in exchange for accepting permanent Israeli control, while maintaining rhetoric of peace and development disguising fundamental reality of continued occupation and apartheid. This pattern repeats across every Israeli proposal since Oslo Accords, where Israel offered Palestinians limited self-governance and disconnected Bantustan surrounded by Israeli military control, presented as pathway to statehood, while Israel systematically expanded settlements, making Palestinian state geographically impossible. Oslo Accords signed September 1993 promised Palestinian statehood within 5 years through interim arrangements establishing Palestinian Authority with limited administrative control over fragmented Palestinian areas, while Israel retained security control and settlement expansion rights. Palestinians accepted this framework, believing interim arrangements would lead to full withdrawal and independent Palestinian state. Instead, Israel exploited Oslo's ambiguity to double settlement population from 281,000 in 1993 to 700,000 in 2026, while maintaining complete military control over 60% of West Bank classified as Area C, fragmenting remaining Palestinian areas into 165 disconnected enclaves surrounded by Israeli checkpoints, preventing territorial continuity essential for viable state. The economic development promised under Oslo, including industrial zones, tourism projects, and trade facilitation, materialized only in forms that maintain Palestinian economic dependence on Israel through customs union, keeping Palestinian economy captive to Israeli trade policies, through Israeli control over Palestinian tax revenues that Israel withholds arbitrarily as punishment for Palestinian political positions, and through systematic restrictions on Palestinian economic activity, including prohibitions on Palestinian development in Area C, covering 60% of West Bank, where all natural resources and space for economic growth are located. Camp David Summit July 2000 saw Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offer Palestinian state on 91% of West Bank with land swaps, portrayed in Western media as generous offer Palestinians irrationally rejected. But examination of actual proposal reveals it maintained Israeli control over Jerusalem, including all holy sites, granted Israel permanent military presence in Jordan Valley comprising 28% of West Bank, divided Palestinian territory into 4 disconnected cantons separated by Israeli settlements and Israeli-controlled roads, and required Palestinians to renounce refugee right of return, affecting 5.8 million refugees. The 91% of West Bank claim was misleading because it excluded Jerusalem, which constitutes occupied Palestinian territory under international law, and because land swaps offered Palestinians desert areas near Gaza in exchange for prime settlement blocks Israel annexed containing crucial water resources. This wasn't generous peace offer, but rather attempt to legitimize Israeli annexation of most valuable Palestinian lands, while confining Palestinians to disconnected Bantustans without sovereignty, territorial continuity, or control over borders, airspace, or electromagnetic spectrum, attributes essential for genuine statehood under international law. Trump administration's Peace to Prosperity plan, released January 2020, epitomized approach of offering Palestinians economic development in exchange for accepting permanent Israeli control. The plan promised $50 billion economic investment over 10 years for Palestinians, identical amount to your current proposal, presented as pathway to prosperity and development transforming Palestinian economy. But political component revealed the plan granted Israel permanent sovereignty over all settlement blocks comprising 30% of West Bank, granted Israel permanent security control over entire West Bank and Jordan Valley, recognized Jerusalem as undivided Israeli capital, denying Palestinian claims, required Palestinians to demilitarize completely while Israel maintained overwhelming military superiority, and redefined Palestinian statehood as limited autonomy within Israeli security control rather than genuine sovereignty. The plan was negotiated without Palestinian participation, drafted by Israeli officials and pro-Israel American advisors, and presented as take-it-or-leave-it ultimatum rather than genuine negotiation. Palestinians unanimously rejected this plan because $50 billion in economic investment cannot compensate for permanent loss of sovereignty, territorial continuity, Jerusalem, refugee rights, and fundamental requirements of viable statehood under international law. Your current proposal follows identical pattern, offering economic development funds while maintaining fundamental Israeli control structures that make Palestinian freedom impossible. You offer $50 billion for infrastructure, industry, education, healthcare, presented as pathway to prosperity, improving Palestinian living standards, but you simultaneously maintain settlement expansion, building 12,000 new units, maintain military occupation with 645 obstacles restricting Palestinian movement, maintain administrative detention holding 8,400 Palestinians without charges, maintain home demolitions destroying Palestinian structures in Area C and East Jerusalem, maintain the blockade starving Gaza, and maintain apartheid legal system treating Palestinians as subjects without rights while Israeli settlers enjoy full citizenship rights. Economic development under continued occupation isn't prosperity. It's gilded cage-making oppression slightly more comfortable while maintaining fundamental denial of freedom, dignity, and rights. Your attempt to buy Palestinian acceptance of permanent dispossession fails not only because Palestinians reject it, but because international solidarity, particularly from the African continent, which understands colonialism and apartheid from direct experience, supports Palestinian liberation and opposes Israeli apartheid regardless of economic pressures or Western diplomatic manipulation. All 54 African nations recognize the Palestinian struggle as continuation of Africa's own anti-colonial liberation movements that defeated European colonial powers and dismantled apartheid in South Africa, and African nations increasingly reject Western pressure to normalize relations with Israel while occupation and apartheid continue. South Africa leads global efforts holding Israel accountable to international law, filing genocide case at International Court of Justice January 2024, presenting detailed evidence that Israeli military operations in Gaza constitute acts of genocide under Genocide Convention, including killing Palestinians, causing serious bodily and mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of Palestinian population in Gaza, and imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births. South Africa's case draws explicitly on South African experience with apartheid, with South African legal team documenting how Israeli system of fragmentation, segregation, dispossession, and discrimination against Palestinians mirrors apartheid South Africa's Bantustan's Pass Laws, Group Areas Act, and systematic denial of political rights to black South Africans. South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor stated unequivocally, Israel's treatment of Palestinians is worse than apartheid South Africa because at least apartheid South Africa didn't bomb Bantustans with American F-35s, killing 12,000 children in 3 months. The ICJ found South Africa's genocide allegations plausible enough to order provisional measures requiring Israel to prevent genocide, punish incitement to genocide, ensure humanitarian access, and preserve evidence. Unprecedented judicial intervention demonstrating international legal community's serious concern about Israeli actions in Gaza. Beyond South Africa's ICJ case, African nations demonstrate solidarity through diplomatic positions, votes at international forums, and bilateral support for Palestinian rights. At the United Nations General Assembly, African nations vote overwhelmingly for resolutions supporting Palestinian rights and condemning Israeli violations. The November 2023 UN resolution demanding humanitarian truce in Gaza passed 120-14 with 45 abstentions, with 52 of 54 African nations voting in favor. Only Liberia abstained and not a single African nation voted against. The December 2023 UN resolution demanding Israel end occupation of Palestinian territory within 12 months, consistent with ICJ advisory opinion, passed with similar overwhelming African support. At the UN Human Rights Council, African nations consistently support resolutions establishing commissions of inquiry investigating Israeli violations, extending mandates of special rapporteurs on occupied Palestinian territory, and condemning settlement expansion and home demolitions. This consistent African voting pattern across decades and across different resolutions demonstrates unwavering African support for Palestinian rights rooted in shared anti-colonial consciousness, rather than temporary diplomatic positioning subject to pressure or incentives. African nations that previously maintained relations with Israel increasingly sever or downgrade those relations in response to Israeli military operations in Gaza and West Bank. Chad expelled Israeli ambassador November 2023 and suspended all diplomatic relations, citing Israeli genocide in Gaza, requiring African nations to act decisively rather than maintaining business-as-usual diplomacy with apartheid state. South Africa recalled its ambassador to Israel November 2023, downgraded South African embassy in Tel Aviv to liaison office, and closed Israeli embassy in Pretoria. Tunisia severed diplomatic relations with Israel November 2023, stating, Tunisia cannot maintain relations with genocidal regime murdering Palestinian children with impunity. Mauritania, which maintained limited trade relations, suspended all commercial dealings with Israel December 2023. Egypt recalled its ambassador to Israel for consultations December 2023, citing Israeli refusal to implement ceasefire and humanitarian access. These diplomatic actions demonstrate African nations increasingly refuse normalizing relations with Israel, while occupation and apartheid continue, regardless of economic incentives or Western diplomatic pressure attempting to isolate African nations taking principled positions on Palestinian rights. The African Union, continental organization representing all 54 African nations, adopted multiple resolutions supporting Palestinian rights and condemning Israeli violations. The African Union Summit February 2024 adopted resolution titled African Solidarity with Palestine, affirming the legitimate right of Palestinian people to self-determination and establishment of independent Palestinian state on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as capital, condemning Israeli occupation, settlement expansion, home demolitions, arbitrary detention, and excessive use of force against Palestinian civilians, including children, calling on African nations to support Palestinian membership in all international organizations, including full UN membership, and urging African nations to implement boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS campaign targeting Israeli products produced in illegal settlements and Israeli corporations complicit in occupation. This African Union resolution wasn't symbolic gesture but rather policy directive requiring member states to implement BDS measures and actively support Palestinian statehood in international forums, demonstrating institutional African commitment to Palestinian liberation as continental priority rather than individual national positions subject to reversal through diplomatic pressure. African civil society organizations, religious leaders, trade unions, student movements, and solidarity groups maintain extensive networks supporting Palestinian rights through education campaigns, protest actions, BDS implementation, and direct support for Palestinian organizations. The Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network coordinates activities across 28 African countries, organizing annual Israeli Apartheid Week events in major African cities, educating African populations about Palestinian struggle and Israeli apartheid, coordinating boycott campaigns against Israeli products and corporations complicit in occupation, and facilitating direct exchanges between African and Palestinian activists, sharing strategies and experiences in anti-colonial struggles. South African trade unions, including COSATU and NUMSA, implement BDS campaigns refusing to handle Israeli cargo at South African ports, refusing to service Israeli ships, and pressuring South African corporations to divest from Israeli companies. South African students organize sustained campaigns pressuring universities to divest from Israeli corporations, including successful campaign pressuring University of Cape Town to divest from companies complicit in Israeli occupation. These grassroots African solidarity movements demonstrate that African support for Palestine isn't merely governmental diplomatic positioning, but rather deep popular commitment rooted in African populations' own anti-colonial consciousness and solidarity with Palestinians as fellow victims of colonialism and apartheid. African support for Palestine draws directly from African historical experience defeating colonialism and dismantling apartheid, recognizing Palestinian struggle as identical fight against same forms of oppression Africa suffered and overcame through decades of liberation struggle. African leaders consistently invoke these parallels. Julius Malema, leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, stated, "Palestinians are fighting same battle we fought against apartheid, struggle for freedom, dignity, and equal rights in their own land against regime that treats them as inferior based on ethnic identity." Naledi Pandor stated, "South Africa's freedom was achieved through international solidarity, including Palestinian support for ANC during our liberation struggle. We owe Palestinians our solidarity now as they fight for their freedom from Israeli apartheid." Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo stated, "Africa understands occupation and colonialism from painful experience. We cannot remain silent while Palestinians endure same oppression we fought to overcome." These statements aren't rhetorical flourishes, but rather expressions of deep African understanding that Palestinian liberation struggle is continuation of global anti-colonial movements that liberated Africa, Asia, and Latin America from European domination, and that Palestinian victory represents another step in completing decolonization that remains unfinished while Israel maintains colonial settlement project and apartheid regime oppressing Palestinians. The parallel between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid isn't rhetorical comparison, but precise legal and structural equivalence documented extensively by international human rights organizations and recognized by South Africans who lived under apartheid and observe identical patterns in Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Desmond Tutu, South African archbishop and anti-apartheid leader who won Nobel Peace Prize for his role in South African liberation, stated after visiting occupied Palestinian territory, "I have witnessed the systemic humiliation of Palestinian men, women, and children by Israeli security forces. I have seen racism previously associated with apartheid South Africa." Tutu documented specific parallels including racial segregation through separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians in West Bank, inferior services and resources provided to Palestinian areas compared to Israeli settlements, passbook system controlling Palestinian movement similar to South African pass laws, military rule over Palestinians while Israeli settlers live under civil law similar to South African Bantustans, an ideological framework of ethnic superiority justifying discriminatory treatment. Ronnie Kasrils, South African government minister and anti-apartheid activist, stated, "Israeli apartheid is worse than what we experienced in South Africa because Israel demolishes Palestinian homes, confiscates Palestinian land, and maintains military occupation with checkpoints and walls. South African apartheid didn't bomb Soweto with American fighter jets." This African solidarity represents strategic threat to your diplomatic efforts normalizing Israeli occupation and apartheid because Africa comprises 54 UN member states, more than 1/4 of UN membership, providing crucial voting bloc in international forums. When African nations vote unified support for Palestinian rights, they frequently swing UN General Assembly votes toward Palestinian positions despite Western opposition. When African nations universally condemned Israeli military operations in Gaza demanding ceasefire and humanitarian access, This African consensus created international pressure isolating United States and Israel diplomatically even when U.S. vetoed Security Council resolutions. When African nations threatened withdrawing from UN institutions if Palestinian membership continues to be blocked, this pressure contributed to growing international support for full Palestinian UN membership. Your attempts to maintain international legitimacy for occupation and apartheid require neutralizing or reversing African opposition, but African commitment to Palestinian liberation rooted in shared anti-colonial consciousness and reinforced through grassroots solidarity movements proves highly resistant to diplomatic pressure or economic incentives attempting to change African positions. You depend entirely on American diplomatic protection shielding you from accountability mechanisms that would otherwise impose costs for systematic violations of international law. The United States vetoes UN Security Council resolutions condemning Israeli actions, using veto 45 times between 1972-2023 to protect Israel from international accountability, more UN vetoes defending single country than US has used for all other purposes combined. The United States provides $3.8 billion annually in military assistance to Israel through Foreign Military Financing Program, despite U.S. Leahy law prohibiting military aid to units credibly accused of gross human rights violations. Law State Department refuses to apply to Israeli military despite overwhelming documentation of violations. The United States blocks Palestinian membership in international organizations, including full UN membership despite 139 nations recognizing Palestinian statehood and supporting membership. The United States pressures International Criminal Court threatening sanctions against ICC prosecutors investigating Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, including Trump administration sanctions against ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda when she opened preliminary examination into situation in Palestine. This American diplomatic protection enables your impunity, allowing you to violate international law systematically without facing consequences that would modify your behavior or impose costs making violations unsustainable. But American power to protect you is declining systematically as United States loses global influence through failed military interventions, economic competitors challenge dollar dominance, and developing nations increasingly reject American dictation in favor of independent foreign policies aligned with their national interests rather than American preferences. The American failure to prevent overwhelming international support for Palestinian rights at UN General Assembly demonstrates declining U.S. ability to control international institutions. When 120 nations vote demanding Gaza ceasefire despite American opposition, when 139 nations recognize Palestinian statehood despite American pressure, when International Court of Justice issues arrest warrant for you despite American threats, these outcomes prove American diplomatic power is insufficient to maintain isolation of Palestine or protection of Israel from accountability. American public opinion is shifting dramatically against unconditional support for Israel, particularly among younger Americans who increasingly recognize Israeli treatment of Palestinians as apartheid, requiring accountability rather than unconditional support. Polling conducted by Pew Research Center December 2023 found that 53% of Americans under age 30 believe U.S. provides too much support to Israel, 67% of young Americans support conditioning military aid to Israel on improvements in treatment of Palestinians, and 72% of young Democrats sympathize more with Palestinians than Israelis, representing dramatic shift from older generations where 58% of Americans over 65 sympathize more with Israel. This generational shift means future American political leadership will face domestic pressure to condition or reduce support for Israel rather than maintaining current unconditional support, particularly as progressive Democratic legislators including Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren increasingly challenge American complicity in Israeli violations and call for conditioning military aid on compliance with international law and human rights standards. American university campuses witnessed massive student movements demanding universities divest from Israeli corporations complicit in occupation, with successful divestment campaigns at major universities including Columbia University, Brown University, Stanford University, and University of California system representing future American political and economic leadership. American trade unions including United Auto Workers, Service Employees International Union, and National Education Association adopted resolutions supporting Palestinian rights and calling for U.S. policy changes including conditioning military aid to Israel. American religious organizations including dozens of Christian denominations, Jewish Voice for Peace with 70,000 members and if not now mobilizing young American Jews against occupation demonstrate significant American domestic opposition to unconditional U.S. support for Israel. These American domestic movements create political constraints limiting future American administrations' ability to provide unlimited diplomatic protection and military assistance to Israel regardless of Israeli actions, particularly as American voters increasingly prioritize domestic issues including healthcare, education, and economic inequality over foreign policy commitments benefiting Israel at American taxpayer expense. You invested enormous diplomatic efforts attempting to normalize relations with Arab nations through Abraham Accords signed 2020 with UAE and Bahrain, with Morocco and Sudan subsequently joining, attempting to isolate Palestinians by creating Israeli relations with Arab states without resolving Palestinian issue or ending occupation. You calculated that Arab nations would prioritize economic ties with Israel over solidarity with Palestinians, that technological cooperation and security partnerships would overcome historical Arab support for Palestinian rights, and that Palestinians could be pressured into accepting unfavorable terms once abandoned by traditional Arab allies. Your strategy appeared successful temporarily as UAE invested billions in Israeli technology companies, Bahrain opened Israeli embassy in Manama, and Morocco resumed limited diplomatic relations after decades of severance. But October 2023, Israeli military operations in Gaza shattered normalization momentum completely, forcing Arab populations to confront the contradiction between their government's relations with Israel and their population's solidarity with Palestinians suffering Israeli bombardment broadcast live on Al Jazeera and social media. Massive protests erupted across Arab nations, including Jordan, where 200,000 protesters demanded canceling peace treaty with Israel and closing Israeli embassy. Morocco, where hundreds of thousands protested demanding government sever relations with Israel. Egypt, where protests at Al-Azhar University demanded expelling Israeli ambassador. And UAE, where despite authoritarian restrictions on protests, Emiratis expressed anger at UAE normalization with Israel, while Palestinians suffered Israeli bombardment. These protests forced Arab governments that normalized relations to distance themselves from Israel publicly. UAE foreign minister condemned Israeli military operations, Bahrain recalled ambassador, Morocco suspended parliamentary cooperation, and Jordan canceled meetings scheduled with Israeli officials. Saudi Arabia, critical prize in normalization efforts given Saudi Arabia's leadership role in Islamic world and economic importance, indefinitely suspended normalization talks with Israel that were advancing rapidly before October 2023, with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stating publicly, Saudi Arabia will not normalize relations with Israel without credible pathway to Palestinian statehood, representing significant reversal from earlier Saudi positions suggesting normalization could proceed with symbolic gestures toward Palestinians rather than requiring actual resolution. This Saudi position reflects Saudi assessment that normalizing with Israel while military operations in Gaza continue broadcast live across Arab media would create a domestic political crisis threatening the monarchy's legitimacy given Saudi population's solidarity with Palestinians and religious significance of Al-Aqsa Mosque under Israeli control. Qatar, which hosts major U.S. military base, maintains strong relations with Hamas, providing $480 million annually to Gaza, mediates between Israel and Hamas, but refuses diplomatic relations with Israel, stating, normalization requires Israeli withdrawal from occupied territory and Palestinian statehood. Cosmetic peace agreements while occupation continues are betrayal of Palestinian rights and Arab dignity. Turkey under President Erdogan suspended trade relations with Israel worth $7.8 billion annually in response to Gaza military operations, with Erdogan condemning you personally as war criminal who must face justice at International Criminal Court, and characterizing Israeli military operations as genocide against Palestinians that every Muslim has obligation to oppose. Turkey previously maintained extensive economic and security cooperation with Israel, including military purchases, intelligence sharing, and Turkish mediation between Israel and Syria, but Erdogan calculated that maintaining Israeli relations while military operations continued would alienate Turkish population and undermine Turkey's leadership ambitions in Islamic world. Iran continues providing military support to Hamas through weapons smuggling and training, provides financial support estimated at $100 million annually, and coordinates regional resistance through Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthis in Yemen, demonstrating continued Iranian commitment to supporting Palestinian resistance regardless of Western sanctions or Israeli military threats. This regional opposition means your normalization strategy attempting to isolate Palestinians failed fundamentally because Arab populations refuse accepting Israeli occupation and apartheid regardless of their government's diplomatic calculations, and because governments that attempted normalization face domestic political costs forcing reversal or suspension of normalized relations. You cannot achieve regional acceptance while maintaining occupation, settlement expansion, and military operations killing thousands of Palestinian civilians broadcast live across Arab media inflaming Arab populations who view Palestinian suffering as a shared Arab and Islamic issue requiring solidarity rather than accommodation with the oppressor. 3 minutes ago, I rejected your $50 billion proposal in 15 seconds because I understand what you fundamentally refuse to accept. Palestinian rights are not commodities that can be purchased at any price. You offer money thinking Palestinian demands for freedom, dignity, justice, and return are negotiable positions subject to economic trade-offs where sufficient financial incentives might persuade Palestinians to abandon rights and accept permanent dispossession. But rights are inalienable inherent attributes of human dignity that cannot be traded regardless of economic incentives because surrendering rights means surrendering humanity itself. Our right to self-determination recognized in UN Charter and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is not for sale. Our right to return to homes and lands from which we were expelled recognized in UN General Assembly Resolution 194 is not for sale. Our right to sovereignty over our territory, including East Jerusalem, recognized in UN Security Council Resolution 23 and 34 is not for sale. Our right to resist occupation recognized under international law is not for sale. Our right to equality before the law free from apartheid recognized in International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is not for sale. These rights are not subject to negotiation, are not amenable to economic trade-offs, and will not be surrendered regardless of financial incentives, military pressure, or diplomatic isolation you attempt imposing. You are internationally recognized war criminal with ICC arrest warrant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, making you legally indistinguishable from Slobodan Milosevic, who orchestrated ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, killing 8,000 Muslims at Srebrenica, from Charles Taylor, who armed militias that murdered and mutilated civilians across Sierra Leone and Liberia, from Omar al-Bashir, who conducted genocide in Darfur, killing 300,000 civilians, or from any other war criminal prosecuted at international tribunals for systematic violations of fundamental humanitarian law. The International Criminal Court issued your arrest warrant November 2024 after exhaustive investigation by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan examining evidence from multiple sources including satellite imagery documenting destruction of entire Gaza neighborhoods, testimony from survivors describing deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, forensic analysis of munitions used confirming deployment of 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated residential areas, and communications intercepts revealing knowledge that strikes would cause massive civilian casualties. The ICC pretrial chamber found reasonable grounds to believe you bear criminal responsibility for war crimes including willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against civilian population, extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity, and using starvation as method of warfare, and for crimes against humanity including murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts causing great suffering. This arrest warrant means 124 ICC member states are legally obligated to arrest you immediately if you enter their territory, transferring you to The Hague for prosecution, meaning you cannot travel to Europe, Africa, Latin America, or most of Asia without facing arrest, making you international fugitive confined to Israel and handful of non-ICC states willing to harbor war criminal. Your hands are stained with blood of 30,000 Palestinian civilians, including 12,300 children you murdered through deliberate military operations targeting residential areas, hospitals, schools, and refugee camps with full knowledge these strikes would kill civilians in massive numbers but proceeding anyway because your military doctrine treats Palestinian civilian deaths as acceptable costs of achieving military objectives or as deliberate strategy of collective punishment terrorizing entire population. These aren't accidental deaths from errant munitions or tragic mistakes in fog of war. These are foreseeable, inevitable, deliberate consequences of your decisions to drop 2,000-pound bombs manufactured by Boeing and Lockheed Martin on apartment buildings housing dozens of families, to launch airstrikes on hospitals treating wounded civilians, including Al-Shifa Hospital, Indonesian Hospital, and Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital, to bomb schools operated by United Nations Relief and Works Agency serving as shelters for families displaced by your previous bombardments, and to strike refugee camps, including Jabalia Camp, where airstrikes killed entire multi-generational families sheltering in UNRWA schools, believing UN facilities would provide safety from Israeli bombardment. Every single one of these 30,000 deaths represents human being with name, family, dreams, relationships, mothers who will never hold their children again, fathers who died trying to dig family members from rubble with bare hands, children who experienced absolute terror in final moments as buildings collapsed on them, grandparents who survived Nakba in 1948 only to die in Nakba Redux 75 years later, teenagers who dreamed of education and careers and love cut short by American-made missiles fired from American-made F-35s piloted by Israeli forces implementing your orders. Among the 12,300 children killed were infants who died in incubators when you cut electricity to hospitals, toddlers crushed under concrete when you bombed their homes at night while families slept, elementary school students killed when you bombed their schools, teenagers shot by snipers when they approached aid trucks seeking food during famine you deliberately created through total blockade. Your regime maintains apartheid system that International Court of Justice ruled illegal and requiring immediate termination in advisory opinion issued July 2024 after examining 57 years of Israeli occupation practices in West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The ICJ, world's highest judicial authority on international law established by UN Charter with jurisdiction to interpret international legal obligations, examined whether Israeli occupation violates international law through systematic policies of settlement construction, resource exploitation, movement restrictions, discriminatory legal system, and denial of Palestinian self-determination. The ICJ concluded definitively that Israeli practices constitute illegal annexation and apartheid under international law, specifically finding that Israel's transfer of 700,000 settlers into occupied Palestinian territory violates Article 49 of Fourth Geneva Convention prohibiting occupying powers from transferring their population into occupied territory, that Israel's exploitation of Palestinian natural resources including water from mountain aquifer and minerals from Dead Sea constitutes pillage prohibited under international humanitarian law, that Israel's two-tier legal system where Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law with full rights while Palestinians live under military law without rights constitutes apartheid under International Convention on Suppression and Punishment of Crime of Apartheid, and that Israel's 57-year occupation denying Palestinian self-determination violates their inalienable right recognized in UN Charter and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The ICJ ordered Israel to immediately cease all settlement activities, to evacuate all settlers from occupied Palestinian territory, to dismantle separation wall declared illegal in ICJ's 2004 advisory opinion, to make full reparations to Palestinians for damages caused by 57 years of illegal occupation calculated at hundreds of billions of dollars, and to allow return of all displaced Palestinians. The ICJ also ruled that all UN member states have legal obligations under international law to not recognize illegal situation created by Israeli occupation, to distinguish in their dealings between Israel proper and occupied territories refusing to treat settlements as part of Israel, and to ensure Israel complies with international law including through imposing sanctions and cooperating with accountability mechanisms. This definitive ICJ ruling makes clear that Israeli occupation and settlement enterprise are illegal under international law, requiring immediate termination regardless of security justifications Israel claims or negotiations Israel demands. International law doesn't permit permanent occupation or settlement of conquered territory under any circumstances. Your settlement enterprise violates Geneva Conventions through systematic transfer of your population into occupied territory, constituting war crime under Rome Statute Article 8, 2, b, 3, which explicitly lists as war crime the transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. This prohibition reflects fundamental humanitarian law principle that occupying powers cannot use military conquest to acquire territory permanently or to alter demographic composition of occupied territory through transferring their own population while displacing indigenous population. Yet you have systematically violated this prohibition for 57 years, establishing 279 settlements and 147 outposts throughout West Bank housing 700,000 Israeli settlers who control 42% of West Bank land, including most fertile agricultural areas, richest water resources, and most strategic locations. These settlements aren't temporary military necessities justified by security needs. They are permanent civilian communities with suburban infrastructure including swimming pools, shopping centers, parks, and schools built on private Palestinian land seized through military orders, state expropriations, declarations of state lands applied selectively to Palestinian-owned land but not to Israeli settler land, and outright theft by settlers establishing illegal outposts that Israeli government retroactively legalizes. Your government provides settlements with $1.2 billion annually in subsidies, including housing subsidies, making settlement living 30% cheaper than living in Israel proper. Infrastructure investments building bypass roads connecting settlements to Israel while bypassing Palestinian towns. Water infrastructure providing unlimited water to settlements while restricting Palestinian access. And security costs deploying Israeli military to protect settlements from Palestinians whose land was stolen to build settlements. This systematic settlement expansion proves Israeli intent is permanent annexation rather than temporary occupation, and proves Israeli policy aims at altering demographic composition, making Palestinian state impossible through facts on ground. Classic colonial settlement strategy identical to French colonization of Algeria, British colonization of Kenya, and other colonial projects where occupying power transferred its population into conquered territory, displacing indigenous population to facilitate permanent control. Your blockade of Gaza creates famine conditions constituting deliberate starvation of civilian population prohibited under international humanitarian law, including Article 54 of Additional Protocol into Geneva Conventions, which prohibits starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and prohibits attacking, destroying, or rendering useless objects indispensable to survival of civilian population, including foodstuffs, agricultural areas, crops, livestock, drinking water installations, and irrigation works. Yet you have maintained total blockade of Gaza since 2007, 19 years of comprehensive closure restricting all movement of people and goods into and out of Gaza through land, sea, and air. Your blockade restricts food imports to bare minimum levels calculated by Israeli military officials to keep Gaza population on diet, preventing humanitarian catastrophe that would generate international pressure while maintaining chronic malnutrition, weakening population. Calculation revealed in 2012 when Israeli human rights organization Gisha obtained through Freedom of Information lawsuit internal Israeli documents showing military officials calculated minimum calories required to avoid malnutrition crisis, then restricted food imports accordingly. Your blockade restricts medical supplies, including cancer medications, surgical equipment, and diagnostic machines, forcing Gaza hospitals to operate without essential supplies. Your blockade restricts construction materials, including cement, steel, and glass, preventing repair of infrastructure damaged by previous Israeli military operations and preventing construction of housing for 70,000 Palestinians whose homes you destroyed. Your blockade restricts fuel imports, creating electricity crisis where Gaza receives only 4 to 6 hours electricity daily, preventing hospital equipment from functioning, preventing water desalination plants from operating, preventing sewage treatment plants from processing waste that consequently flows untreated into Mediterranean. Your blockade restricts fishing to 6 to 9 nautical miles from shore, preventing fishermen from reaching productive fishing areas, enforcing this restriction through naval gunboats that shoot at Palestinian fishing boats that venture beyond designated zone, killing dozens of Palestinian fishermen since 2007. Your blockade creates unemployment exceeding 45% because businesses cannot import materials or export products, creating poverty where 65% of Gaza population depends on humanitarian aid for survival. This systematic deprivation doesn't result from resource scarcity or economic necessity, but rather from deliberate Israeli policy designed to collectively punish Gaza population for electing Hamas government in 2006, to pressure Gaza population to overthrow Hamas through making life unbearable, and to demonstrate to all Palestinians that resistance to Israeli occupation will result in collective punishment, destroying entire communities. International humanitarian law absolutely prohibits collective punishment under Geneva Convention Article 33, which states, "No protected person may be punished for an offense he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited." Your 19-year blockade punishing 2.3 million Palestinians for actions of Hamas that most Gazans didn't participate in or support constitutes textbook collective punishment prohibited under international law regardless of security justifications you claim. You maintain systematic torture in detention facilities where 8,400 Palestinian prisoners, including 340 children, experience physical abuse, sexual violence, sleep deprivation, prolonged stress positions, threats against family members, denial of medical treatment, and solitary confinement for extended periods. Israeli human rights organizations, including B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, document systematic torture in Israeli detention through testimony from hundreds of released detainees describing nearly identical abuse patterns, suggesting systematic policy rather than isolated misconduct by individual soldiers. Released detainees describe being beaten during arrest, often in front of family members, to maximize humiliation, being transported to detention facilities in stress positions with hands cuffed behind backs and bags over heads preventing breathing properly, being stripped naked during interrogation while interrogators mock their bodies and religious beliefs, being subjected to sleep deprivation through all-night interrogations and loud music preventing sleep for days, being forced into painful stress positions including sitting on low stools with hands cuffed behind backs for hours, being threatened with rape or harm to family members including explicit threats to arrest and rape female relatives, being denied urgently needed medical treatment for injuries sustained during arrest or for chronic conditions requiring medication, and being held in solitary confinement in cells without windows or natural light for weeks or months, causing severe psychological damage. UN Special Rapporteur on Torture documented these practices in multiple reports, concluding that Israeli interrogation and detention practices constitute torture under Convention Against Torture, which defines torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for purposes of obtaining information, punishment, intimidation, or coercion. Israel ratified Convention Against Torture in 1991, accepting legal obligation to prevent torture and to criminally prosecute torturers, yet Israeli domestic law permits special interrogation techniques, including moderate physical pressure against Palestinian detainees suspected of security offenses, legal euphemisms authorizing interrogation methods that constitute torture under international law. Israeli Supreme Court ruled 1999 that torture is prohibited under Israeli law, yet that ruling included loopholes permitting interrogators to use torture in ticking bomb scenarios, claiming necessity defense, and permitting interrogators who torture to avoid prosecution if they claim they reasonably believe torture was necessary, loopholes ensuring continued impunity for Israeli interrogators who torture Palestinian detainees routinely. You conduct home demolitions, punishing families collectively for actions of relatives accused of attacking Israelis, demolishing entire family homes with explosives, leaving families homeless regardless of whether family members participated in, knew about, or supported accused relatives' actions. Between 2000 and 2026, you demolished 420 Palestinian homes as punitive demolitions, punishing families of accused attackers, rendering 2,800 Palestinians homeless, including 1,400 children who lost their homes, their belongings, their sense of security, and often their ability to continue education when forced to move away from schools. These punitive demolitions constitute collective punishment prohibited under Geneva Convention Article 33 and constitute war crime under Rome Statute. Beyond punitive demolitions, you conduct thousands of administrative demolitions claiming Palestinian structures were built without permits, yet Israeli military administration issues building permits to Palestinians at rate of 1 to 2% of applications, ensuring virtually all Palestinian construction is technically illegal, creating pretext for demolitions that serve underlying purpose of preventing Palestinian development in Area C, comprising 60% of West Bank where Israel seeks to expand settlements. Between 2000 and 2026, you demolished 8,400 Palestinian structures through administrative demolitions, displacing 18,000 Palestinians, while simultaneously approving 12,000 new settlement units in same areas, demonstrating demolitions aren't enforcing neutral planning regulations, but rather implementing discriminatory policy facilitating settlement expansion while preventing Palestinian development. You enforce discriminatory legal system treating Palestinians as subjects without rights while granting Israeli settlers full citizenship, classic apartheid structure creating different legal status for people living in same territory based on ethnic identity. In West Bank, 700,000 Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law with full citizenship rights, including voting in Israeli elections, access to Israeli courts providing due process protections, freedom of movement throughout West Bank and Israel without restrictions, social benefits including health care and education through Israeli systems, and protection by Israeli security forces. Meanwhile, 3 million Palestinians in same West Bank territory live under Israeli military law imposed through military orders issued by military commander without Palestinian input, cannot vote in elections determining policies controlling their lives, face trial in military courts with 99.7% conviction rate where proceedings conducted in Hebrew without adequate translation and where military judges are Israeli military officers not independent jurists, face 645 obstacles restricting movement requiring permits from Israeli military to travel between Palestinian towns, receive minimal services from Palestinian Authority that lacks resources and authority to provide adequate health care and education, and face violence from Israeli soldiers and settlers without effective legal recourse because Israeli criminal justice system prosecutes less than 3% of complaints Palestinians file against Israeli soldiers or settlers. This two-tier system where people's legal status, rights, and treatment depend on ethnic identity rather than citizenship or residency constitutes apartheid under International Convention on Suppression and Punishment of Crime of Apartheid, which defines apartheid as inhuman acts committed for purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over any other racial group and systematically oppressing them, including through denial to a member of a racial group of the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence, and persecution of organizations and persons by depriving them of fundamental rights and freedoms because they oppose apartheid. All these practices, systematic killings of civilians including children, settlement expansion constituting war crime, blockade creating deliberate starvation, torture in detention facilities, punitive home demolitions, discriminatory legal system constituting apartheid, constitute crimes under international law requiring individual criminal accountability for those responsible. You bear command responsibility as Prime Minister and Defense Minister controlling Israeli military and authorizing operations that commit these violations. Command responsibility doctrine established through Nuremberg trials, Tokyo Tribunal, ICTY prosecution of Yugoslav commanders, ICTR prosecution of Rwandan commanders, and codified in Rome Statute Article 28 holds commanders criminally responsible for crimes committed by subordinates if commander knew or should have known subordinates were committing crimes and failed to prevent crimes or punish perpetrators. You cannot claim ignorance of these crimes when they are documented extensively by Israeli human rights organizations, UN investigations, international human rights organizations, and broadcast globally through media coverage, meaning you have actual knowledge of crimes committed by Israeli forces under your command. You cannot claim inability to prevent these crimes when you control Israeli military through defense ministry, approve military operations, and could stop violations through issuing orders to Israeli forces. You cannot claim you're prosecuting perpetrators when Israeli military justice system prosecutes less than 1% of complaints against Israeli soldiers, when military prosecutors close investigations citing insufficient evidence despite video documentation, and when soldiers who are prosecuted receive minimal sentences. Soldier who shot bound Palestinian prisoner at point-blank range caught on video received 9-month sentence, later reduced to 4 months. Soldiers who killed 78-year-old Palestinian woman at checkpoint and then manipulated evidence received no jail time. Sniper who shot Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, clearly identified as press, received no charges. This systematic impunity proves you do not prevent crimes or punish perpetrators, instead creating an environment where Israeli soldiers know they can kill Palestinians with impunity, including deliberately targeting civilians, creating command climate where violations are normalized and expected rather than prohibited and punished. So when you offer us $50 billion, what you're actually asking is that we grant you immunity from prosecution by accepting financial compensation instead of demanding criminal accountability through international criminal court and domestic courts with universal jurisdiction over war crimes and crimes against humanity. You're asking that we legitimize your crimes by accepting compensation for our dispossession, enabling you to claim Palestinians accepted Israeli control in exchange for economic benefits rather than continuing to demand return, sovereignty, and justice. You're asking that we renounce our rights, enabling you to claim Palestinian acceptance of permanent Israeli control, providing legitimacy for continued occupation and apartheid that international law rules illegal. You're asking that we become complicit in our own oppression by accepting payment for surrendering our children's future, trading their inalienable rights to freedom, dignity, sovereignty, and return for economic development projects that maintain fundamental power structures denying Palestinian rights while making oppression slightly more comfortable through improved infrastructure built on stolen land controlled by occupying power. We absolutely refuse. We refuse because accepting money for surrendering rights means valuing material comfort over human dignity and freedom. We refuse because our martyrs who died fighting for liberation deserve justice, not economic compensation. We refuse because future generations deserve inheriting freedom and sovereignty, not permanent subjugation disguised as economic development. We refuse because international law recognizes our rights as inalienable, non-negotiable legal entitlements, not subject to economic transactions. We refuse because accepting your offer would betray every Palestinian who suffered displacement, imprisonment, torture, home demolition, family separation, denial of education and health care, and systematic humiliation under your occupation and apartheid. We refuse because Palestinian liberation struggle represents continuation of global anti-colonial movements that defeated European colonialism across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Accepting your offer would betray that global struggle, demonstrating that colonialism can succeed if colonizer offers enough money.